Dr. Canonica, from your evidence, what have you seen about immunotherapy in clinical evidence?
First, let me say that I wish to make a premise. We are always talking about evidence, and we heard about efficacy in a clinical trial and in meta-analysis, that immunotherapy, both the subcutaneous route and the sublingual route, are effective. And this, unfortunately, I would say, was the conclusion that is also in some recent guidelines. But this is not correct. Why? Because we included in the meta-analysis all the studies performed with some products, whereas in clinical practice are used also some other products. So I think that it's really the time to stop a little bit and to think about and to talk about real effectiveness, but we should consider two different kind of preparation or treatments. The one that got evidences and the ones that didn't get evidences. Nonetheless, I'm very supportive about the concept of, you mentioned, of effectiveness that is coming from real life studies. So in other words, nowadays also the guidelines, and then if you wish I will comment about what is the impact of the guidelines. I must say that there are two different kind of studies that have to be considered in the guidelines. One is the ones that are performed for registration of products, as for any kind of drugs. But then we need also the real life studies. And I think that nowadays it's time to consider both of them in terms of evaluation in the guidelines, because this is the best way to approach the treatment for the patients.
Dr. Bachert, do you agree? Do we now need to go from clinical evidence to more real-life evidence?
I wouldn't term it like that. I would say, of course, we first need the studies for registration, which consist of dose finding today. Very delicate studies where we calculate the number of patients to be included in these studies, power analysis before we start. And that is a culture, I would say, that just comes up the last 15, 20 years. So a lot of the older studies were not done according to that scheme. So that's very important. This is the basis we would have. But knowing that these studies have been done under specific conditions in terms of selections of patients, in terms of follow-up of the patients, monitoring that they really take their drugs and so on, which is not translated into real life one-to-one, we need real life studies. That means, and there we have to work with surrogate markers, we need to figure out when patients with a certain diagnosis have been included in a specific treatment, and again, I fully support this, it's extremely important what drug we are talking about, not just immunotherapy in general, then we can have an idea of how, for example, changes the use of rhinitis medication once the patient is under immunotherapy. How far does the onset of asthma is reduced really under real-life conditions? And that concludes, not just the drug, but also the patient's compliance, the methods of keeping patients adherent and compliant. So we are talking really about the translation of these studies into real life, which I totally agree are very important.
Dr. Bousquet, your vision?
Well, I think that we are paying too much attention to guidelines. Guidelines are based on goals of patients that merely do not exist in real life. They are based on trials with a high level of adherence, and they are based on a few products, what you said. Now we need to go to next generation care pathways. A care pathway is not a guideline. It is the guideline, of course, but it is also self-medication, all stakeholders, what patient feels, and so on. So we are now going to a new era, which is called Next Generation Care Pathways for rhinitis and asthma, a model for non-communicable diseases. And this is a project from the European Institute for Innovation and Technology Health. So we will need to do real-life studies, and we can do that very easily with cell phones. And one of the topics will be next generation guidelines. That is to say that the grade recommendations, not the others, the grade recommendations, it is a specific method which is developed in Canada, will be tested in real life to see whether the recommendations which are proposed really fit to real life.
Dr. Shamji, is that the objective that you see too for real-life evidence?
I think it's really important to really think about the digital platform and the care pathway. The next generation care pathway seems to be what's really important in thinking about how can we move on and think about really our patients. And guidelines are there, they're important, but equally we need to think into the future, and we really need to think how best can we reach our patients. And our main goal, our endeavors, is to bring immunotherapy into our daily clinical practice, and we need to think about how do we really implement that.
Well, we have some real-life evidence in our panel this morning. Sébastien de Boer, you are a patient. Can you briefly say what you have and what immunotherapy has meant for you?
Well, I started to suffer from allergy for pollen, so grass and typical type of herbs, when I was about 6-7 years old. So now it's close to 40 years ago. It's really a long time. I've been suffering until a few years ago, and in real life it meant during springtime and summertime really locking myself up in the house while my wife and children could play outside.
And what was the medical therapy that you had at that time?
Well, at that time was two type, was a kind of drug I took in the morning, antihistaminicum, to reduce my allergic reaction, and at the same time something to put in my eye to also lower down the reaction in my eye. Was not sufficient. Some of them makes me sleep a lot, so after a lot of different types of medication taken, I could find the right one. When I would go to an open space with a lot of grass, I took maybe, and maybe it's not right to say it, but I took maybe 10 times the doses which was allowed in order to be able to stay over there. Which is not nice, but it was the only way to stand on a public field with a lot of trees and grass. So a few years ago, I got in contact with a professor at the University of Leuven, and I was asking him, please help me. I'm now 44 today. Help me because I'm completely bored out with all these medicines I need to take. I lock myself up during spring and summertime. So can you do something? And he said, okay, first I will do some, there was some wrong construction in my nose as well. So he did some operation, and next to it, he offered me immunotherapy, which I will start this year for the 3rd year in a row. But during summertime this year, so after 2 years, I feel completely relieved. I can go outside during summer. I can go to, for example, a festival pitch with a lot of trees, and I don't suffer anymore. I even don't take medication anymore. So this has completely changed my daily life. I'm very happy I could get access to this therapy.